Howdy y'all, welcome to my channel. Today I will be sharing with you how to take some very simple products to help create a wonderful card. The techniques that I will share with you are direct to paper, making your own thickers, and the Joseph's coat technique as well. So set a spell, kick your shoes off, and let's begin. So we have some glossy paper here and gathered some ink, gathered wild honey, fired brick, and crushed olive. I'm going to lay down the crushed olive first onto our glossy paper. Okay, we're just going to wait a minute for it to dry up a bit. Okay, now we're going to bring in the wild honey. We're just going to kind of shimmy it around. Now we're going to bring in the fired brick and we're going to shimmy it also. Okay. Now that the ink has dried, I'm going to explain why this is me going back to basics. Actually, if we want to go really back to basics, when I first started stamping, these are the first ink pads that I ever purchased. And yes, I have the re-inker, which is why I still have these ink pads. So when I first started stamping, I had 3 ink pads and I didn't have hardly any stamps, so I had to learn how to do a lot with just those 3 ink pads. And I'm going to use these stamps today. Now these stamps don't have any there's no rhyme or reason to them. Honestly, I would say these stamps are far better than the first set of stamps I purchased because, well, I had to start from scratch, honestly. I didn't have any stamps when I started out. So in all honesty, I actually started out with these stamps. These stamps were from the dollar bin, and I still have them all these years later. They still serve a purpose. Now, I don't use them all the time. Occasionally, I will bring them out and use them. So I keep them here in this little drawer unit. So I guess I would say that this is sort of going back to basics again because I did start out with clear stamps, and these are clear stamps, but there's a bit of a difference because mine were much smaller, whereas these are a nice size stamp. So now we are going to bring in our powder tool because we are going to stamp these onto our sheet of glossy paper, and we're going to heat emboss them. So that's why we need the powder tool, because that way we can prep the panel up so that we can then do the heat embossing. Actually, I don't know what I'm doing here. Hang on. Now granted, when I started stamping, there were no stamping platforms like this. The closest you got to a stamping platform would be, I'll show you. This right here was a revolutionary tool. We didn't have things where you could just stamp them all at once, and then, you know, if you messed up, you could try to make sure everything's realigned and stamp again. But, you know, I wouldn't necessarily say these are that worthwhile, but, you know, that's just me. Actually, a lot of stamps either came as clear or wood mounted. Now, I don't have any wood mounted stamps to actually show you. Wait, I take that back. Here, this is a wood mounted stamp. Now, I don't actually stamp with this stamp. I actually just keep it on my shelf because, well, it's a precious moments stamp and I love precious moments and I collect precious moments. So yeah, this just spends time in my craft room. Oh, and wood mounted stamps used to get super dirty. It was really hard to clean them off, so you just did your best. Whereas now, you can just decide whether you want them wood mounted or whether you want it cling mounted, whether you want naked rubber that you can cling mount yourself, or whether you want clear stamps. So that would be going all the way back to basics, at least for me and when I started stamping and making cards. I have shared on a previous video how I got started in card making. And one thing that I got started, when I started card making, one thing that really intimidated me was heat embossing. You know, I was like out of the question. But that's why I'm bringing in my secret weapon for when I like to heat emboss, and that's to actually use frost. With the frost, I can actually see what my stamp is going to look like. So that's why I use this. Now I'm going to take my Dazzle and I'm going to stamp it. Okay. Yeah, that looks good. Now we're going to bring in our coffee filters, and we're also going to bring in some clear embossing powder. So now, just pour this back into the jar. Now we're going to bring in our heat embossing gun. Now I'm going to bring in our stamping positioning tool again, and we're going to change up the areas where we use these stamps. I do recommend cleaning your stamps before you move them. You want that a little off from the corner because we want to be able to stamp our leaves, and they're going to be a little on the big side. So now we're going to powder our inked images again. Now we will be covering up the paper that we just created along with the embossed leaves using a bit of sponge and some Catherine Pooler icing on the cake. So you just take your bit of sponge and you just rub all over the paper. This helps to cover up all of that ink that you have on the background. Now when you're doing something like this, you will want to use an ink that is darker than your darkest color so that it can cover it up. Okay, so now that you've got your cardstock piece all nice and inky with the dark color, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to bring in a bit of kitchen towel, and you're going to want to take that ink off of your leaves. Now, because we heat embossed our leaves earlier, they were able to do a resist of what we just did to the top of our card. Now, remember, this is just glossy paper that I'm using. It's not the glossy cardstock. I would believe if you use the glossy cardstock, you wouldn't have the warpage issue that I'm having right now. Just letting you know that. But this is a really cool technique that you could try on either glossy paper or glossy cardstock. Now I'm going to set this aside for a minute while we bring out a piece of paper, a piece of cardstock. So what we're going to do now is we want to have some sentiments on our card front, so on the card that we create. So what I'm going to do is some direct paper, and then I'm going to do some die cutting. Now die cutting for me is taking it back to, it's going back to basics for me, because that's actually how I started my card making, was with die cutting. But I know that some people started out with inks, and that's cool. Also, I know that a beginner stamper, like someone just starting out, may not have enough money to purchase different colors of cardstock or purchase some pattern paper, especially if they've purchased ink, you know. Which is why we did this technique, to show you that you could take your ink and create a background. Now what we're going to do with the ink is we're going to show you that you can take your ink and some white cardstock, which everybody should be able to get, and then you just run your ink pad over it as many times as you need to. You may hear people call this swinking, but I'm actually going to call this it's a direct to paper technique. And by that, what I mean is that we are directly taking the ink pad over our paper and we are coloring our paper with our ink pad. We're going to bring in the wild honey and we're going to color it from this side. Do the same direct to paper technique. Looks as though my wild honey is a bit more juicy than the fired brick, and that's okay, because you know, sometimes that's going to happen. That's why it's important when you do buy an ink, especially an ink that you like, that you purchase a re-inker bottle. Now what we're going to do is we are going to bring in our die cuts. So I'm actually going to bring in this alphabet die cut. So we're going to use these letters to create a word. And then I've got this die cut and it says happy. So we're just going to run that through our die cut machine, but I'm going to bring in some washi tape to help hold these dies in place. But if you don't have washi tape on hand, you could always use Post-it note, or you could use a bit of painter's tape, or well, the painter's tape I use is sensitive painter's tape, so, but yeah, you could always use those things in place of washi tape. So I have had this die cut machine forever, and I actually purchased it as a bundle. So I have already applied adhesive sheet to the backing of this cardstock piece, and therefore all we need to do is cut it and then just lay it down on our panel. So we're going to have this gorgeous die cut that says happy. We're also going to have a whole alphabet set using this cardstock that we just colored. Although we won't be using all of the cut pieces, we will be able to save them for a later project. Now, because our panel is very fallish looking, and we already have our first die cut that says happy, I'm going to actually use these letters to form the word fall. But, well, my alpha set only has singles of each letter. So that means I'm going to have to run at least this portion of it through again. So now we have all these letters, and since we already had the letters F, A, and L, we only need the next L, and we can save the rest of the letters for a later project. So we just need to lay this down onto a card base, but because it's all warped, we need to lay this onto something that will help us out. So I'm gonna bring some more sticky sheet, and I'm gonna bring in a Xyron, and I'm going to run this through that Xyron. So while I stepped away for a minute, I changed my mind about using this happy, and We'll instead be using this Happy that is cut out of Kraft cardstock. It will really help set off our card. I also ran our glossy paper through his iron, and we'll be placing that onto our card base. But now we're going to bring this alphabet die cut back in, and we're also going to bring in some fun foam. This is like what you can buy you can find it in the kids arts supplies usually. So we're just going to cut some fun foam, much like we did to get our letters that spell out the word fall. A good thing to have when you are just starting to build your stamping / die cutting collection up is to get an alphabet set with a nice font. That way you can create some fun little sentiments or phrases. Now that our foam letters are cut, we can attach them to the back of our letters that we cut out of the paper that we created when we did a direct to paper technique. And I like to use my Spellbinders tool-in-one. This is a multi-purpose tool, and you can actually remove the components and place different ones in so you can use it for whatever project you're working on. Now, I learned a long time ago that having die cuts makes things a lot better and easier on you rather than buying thickers, because you can make your own thickers. You can make as thick a letter as you want, and that goes for whether you are manually die cutting or whether you have an electronic die cutting machine that you can just pick the font you want and the size you want, and yeah, you can cut it out of foam or out of the cardstock or out of chipboard or whatever you want to cut it out of. And that way, if you have a theme you're going with, so like if you were creating a scrapbook and you're using these types of letters, then you could use them throughout your entire scrapbook rather than having to repurchase those letters or purchase X amount of packs of those letters, because you may not always find the amount that you need, whereas you could totally make your own letters and then you determine if you made the proper amount or if you need more, and then you can just make more of your own letters. That was a trick that my mother-in-law taught me. She taught me that because, well, I was spending money on stickers, like alphabet stickers, to put in my scrapbook. So this is our card base, and this is our panel that we just created. Now I'm going to remove the backing. I'm going to place our card base inside of this right here. And now I'm going to let the ends meet up with each other. Now you may need to stand up rather than sit down to do this, just so you're sure that you get your corners all met up. There you go. Now you just remove the backing again, like you did on the letters. And this time you do need to be a bit careful, so I like to bring in a T-square. Here's our word, and we are going to place that down. There you go. Now it says happy, and we just need to remove the backing from our little letters, which we've puffed up by sticking the fun foam behind them. Again, you will need your T-square to help you out. Okay. There you go. We now have a card that says Happy Fall, and all we did was take some really basic steps. So the colors of the ink were not only placed on our glossy paper, but they were also placed on to some cardstock so that we could get our letters to look just like our background. The direct-to-paper technique is a great one to have. It's a great one to know about as you begin your stamping, because that way, instead of buying cardstock that's a specific color, that you may only need like 1 or 2 of that color to make your cardstock, you can create your own cardstock using your ink pads. So those are really some very good starting out steps to know about. Guess what? I not only taught you one technique, so if you liked the video, please give me a thumbs up. If you would like to subscribe to my channel, that would be wonderful, and you just need to click that little subscribe button. The supplies that I used will be listed in the description box below, so I hope y'all stay safe, stay healthy, stay crafty. Bye, y'all.